And welcome everyone to Australian Business Lawyers and Advisors COVID-19 Employer Update. I am Joe Murphy, Managing Director, National Workplace, and with me today is Ian Rennie, Managing Director, Corporate and Commercial. Welcome, Ian.
Thanks, Joe. Glad to be here.
Now today, Ian and I are going to take you through a range of things. I think where you'll get some of the value is the questions that we've received in the lead up to this webcast, but also you'll note that you can ask questions during the webcast. We'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can. After the session, we might come back to you with as many answers as we can through different means. So today we're going to talk about clarity on when you can stand down your employees. This is a big issue. This has been something that we've been dealing with a lot. It's taken up a substantial amount of our time in the last 3 to 4 weeks. Ian's going to take us through some of the business and other commercial considerations that Ian and his team have been facing in the last 3 to 4 weeks and giving advice consistently to clients and members throughout that period. We're going to talk about reducing work hours and some of the changes to the awards that have occurred already and some of the changes that are in the pipeline. We're going to talk about creative options to managing staff leave. A lot of businesses have already implemented these. This might be a time to consider other options that are available to you, particularly given the new JobKeeper subsidy that the federal government has now announced and is quite a welcome announcement to many businesses out there. And then we're going to touch off on some of the questions. And in fact, we might interject during the session with some questions. We might start off with latest government advice.
Okay, what's on the screen is really what Scott Morrison announced as policy over the weekend. For those of us in New South Wales and Queensland, that is actually the law. In both places, that's been brought in under the emergency health legislation. State by state, the situation will differ. But can we please just ask you to obey all of those requirements? They are there for our own good. It's a bit hard to do so on occasions, but we have to back them.
Thanks, Ian. And I think down the bottom of the screen there, you'll see on the slide that we've included a link there to businessaustralia.com. Business Australia, who is a related entity to us, of our parent companies. If you go to that website and register for updates, they have a great COVID-19 hub there as well. You can register at our website as well for the same information, or in fact, slightly different information. Now, we're going to deal with this issue of stand down to start with, and it's got everyone interested. It's not just about workplace lawyers. It's got everyone interested and baffled. It is a bit of a dark art, and it's something that most blue-collar industries have had to deal with over the years when you're talking about mining and construction and the like. But outside of that, it's a largely unknown and inexperienced area for many businesses. We've got up here the effect of the Section 524 of the Fair Work Act. I won't bore you with that too much, but what's really important here is that when we break that down, and you'll get these slides or the availability to these slides after the session, there are 3 key elements out of that section. The first one is that there's a stoppage of work. Now, what's really important is the third dot point, that the employer is not responsible when we're talking about stoppage of work. The stoppage can't be because you as an employer have decided that you want the business to stop working because you're not making enough profit, or the losses the business is incurring are unsustainable. The stoppage of work has to be because there is a cause or a reason that is outside the control of the employer, and it results in an actual stoppage of work. When you get to a point where you do have a part of your business, whether it's a division or a particular function that your business performs, or the whole of your business coming to a halt in terms of the work that they perform, then you need to also consider whether or not there is other work that these employees can perform so that they can be usefully employed in other means or doing other work. Obviously, if the whole business comes to a halt, it's far less likely that you're going to find useful employment for them. But typically where you might find that useful employment kicks in is where you've got a business that has a range of divisions. One or two of those divisions is rendered inert or with no work to do. And at that point, before you turn your mind to standing down those employees on the basis that there's a stoppage of work for those employees, you need to consider whether or not there is work for those employees where they can be usefully employed in other areas of the business. And it doesn't mean making up work for them to do. It doesn't mean, well, we can get this person to sweep the path out the back. It doesn't mean we can get this person to lick envelopes. It does mean that it's work that is within the scope of what they are employed to do, that they're skilled to do, that they're qualified to perform as well.
Joe, can I just ask, so what's the status of a stood-down employee? Are they an employee anymore?
Well, they are. Once a business gets to the point of standing down an employee because there's a stoppage of work and they cannot usefully be employed elsewhere in the business, what then happens is the employee's employment effectively, in one sense, goes into a bit of hibernation, but in another sense keeps ticking along. So what I mean by that is that the service that they accrue whilst they are stood down continues as if they were performing work. So they will accrue entitlements such as annual leave, personal leave, long service leave, but they will not be performing any work and they will not be paid for not performing any work. Other things that they can do while they're stood down, and that is they could ask to take their annual leave, they could ask to take their long service leave, they can take sick leave, and you should also pay them for public holidays while they're stood down. What we have found when it comes to the stand down is that there were quite a few businesses out there that appeared to be standing down their employees in the retail sector in circumstances where it may have been questionable as to whether or not they could actually stand those employees down. And the reason for that is that if you've got a shop front, you're running shops and you're only getting a few people coming in during the day, there's a real question about whether or not that amounts to a stoppage of work. Now, most people would say, who are informed in this area of law, would say that that is not a stoppage of work. There is still work coming in the door. It is a downturn. And in fact, that would give rise to a whole range of other considerations, such as redundancy, but it wouldn't necessarily amount to a stand down. Now, the real tension that's arisen here between stand down and redundancy is that businesses probably, in the most part, rightly conclude that in most cases, standing down an employee, keeping them employed, giving them options for leave and the like, and then having a job for them at the end of the tunnel, when we see the light at the end of the tunnel, is a much better option than terminating their employment and in some cases potentially not paying them much money if they've only been employed for a short period, only to have them either not having a job at the end of what's happening now, the stand down period, and or going off and finding work elsewhere, in which case you no longer have a workforce or you no longer have teams to come back and perform that work, and you've got to go about recruiting those people. So a stand down seems to be a bit of a win-win for employers and for employees, but legally speaking, it's a very high bar to meet.
So can I ask you that question? Because we're going to get on to job seekers in a minute, and that's going to flow on from the consequence of standing down. How does an employer protect themselves for the future? So if they have to come to a decision to stand down employees, what should they be doing to create the evidence trail to protect themselves in the future?
You mean in terms of justifying that it's a proper
Correct.
stoppage?
So
yes, absolutely. So what we are asking clients to do, and that is provide us with the data that and to assist us to provide the advice that confirms whether or not we think that they've reached a point where the business has can justify a stand down. Now, some people call it a demand-driven stand down. A question, someone else, we've used various terms like, is there a point at which the business becomes unviable? There is a point, but you probably have to run the business quite far down the track before it becomes a stand down situation when you talk about viability. When you're talking about demand-driven, that can be driven by a whole range of things. So if we look at if I can take everyone back to the restrictions here, a really good point would be in New South Wales and in Queensland, we have, in Queensland, they call them the home confinement directions. Yep. And in New South Wales, they're the public health order that directing employees to remain at home unless they have to go to work. In Queensland, it's unless they cannot reasonably perform the work at home. In those circumstances, what the effect of the pandemic has had is that it creates an environment where people are voluntarily not going out in public, and now you have a government direction directing people not to go out in public. And so if you fall into an industry where you are not an essential service and your business does not provide one of the categories of businesses in the particular directions amounting to an essential food or service, then there is a real question, there is actually a real possibility that you do get to a point where there's a justifiable situation for a demand-driven stand-down. But obviously it varies from business to business, it varies from industry to industry. But after the recent directions that arrived at the back end of the weekend and on Monday from the New South Wales and Queensland, and I know other states are looking at it as well, and Victoria, where they've declared a state of emergency, in those scenarios, it is you don't make any assumptions about what that means for your business. You still have to do an analysis. And once you've done that analysis, looking at the data as well about the sort of work that you're doing, only then do you arrive at a position of stand down. Yeah. Now, that may have been somewhat dealt with to a degree by the JobKeeper subsidy that's arrived. And we know that, moving on to the JobKeeper's payment subsidy, just very briefly, that this government initiative, which is very welcome, and we would implore all employers who qualify for it or think that they qualify for it to sign up. I know Stephen Cartwright said last night on the news when he was being interviewed, if you're an employer, you'd have to question why you wouldn't join up, sign up for it, because it benefits the business and your employees. But I'll come back to this in some more details. I do have a question here that I'd like to deal with just off the back of what we've been saying about stand down. And this question here is, can a stoppage of work be due to WHS issues? Now, there is, and again, we haven't seen this in the case law, but there is a scenario we believe that arises where the health and safety, the risk to health and safety is at such a level that you do get to a point where the business does engage in a stoppage of work. It will depend on the particular scenario of the business. It'll depend on what's occurring. But this also relates to, for example, where you've got employees who are returning from overseas, who have been quarantined for 14 days, they need to go into isolation. That's a little bit akin to stand down, although it's not quite the same thing. Those employees might be directed to remain away from work for that period because they come from a high-risk country. So there is a concept of a work health and safety risk potentially leading to a stoppage of work or leading to a stand down. But you would need to look at the particular scenario again to come to that view. I would not arrive at that lightly. Health and safety over the years has been an issue that businesses have used to, make particular decisions because it is a heavy burden. But at the same time, you also need to be very careful about being too blasé about making that call about work health and safety.
Some of the football codes, I think, or some of the clubs within the football codes have made that call where they've said that the current environment is such that they cannot guarantee the safety of their players and the support staff, and so they've stood down teams on that basis.
I understand that to be the case. I haven't heard of any being stood down without pay. I know that they were negotiating pay for, for example, in the NRL, they're looking at pay cuts. So at the moment, my understanding was they were being paid full pay. Obviously, when people are being paid, they're not as concerned about being stood down short term. I should acknowledge, though, that, in the current environment and the uncertainty about how long this is going to last, obviously everyone needs to be watching out for everyone and their employees. And I think the NRL's trying to do the right thing by their players. And it's good if you can afford it as a business to come to some arrangement with your employees. And we're going to talk later a little bit about separate arrangements that you can come to. But that leads me into the JobKeeper payment subsidy. And this was announced just this week, and off the back of being lobbied, and I understand it was an idea the government was looking at already, but lobbied by the ACTU, which was supported by the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry and other bodies to really get behind this idea of a wage subsidy that has been implemented in other countries. For example, in New Zealand and the UK, although their systems are slightly different to the one we have here. Just running you through it quickly, and you've probably seen this, but for those of you that haven't, if you're an eligible employer, you can claim a $1,500 payment per fortnight for each eligible employee that you have. And I'll talk about eligible employers and eligible employees definition in a second. And that will run from the 30th of March through until the 30th of September, a 6-month period. During that period, you will be able to claim for each eligible employee that $1,500 per fortnight. Now, in order to be an eligible employer, you have to fall into one of two categories, and that is that you are a business that has a turnover of less than $1 billion and you've had a 30% drop or reduction in turnover by comparison to a comparable period from last year. And in a similar way, if you happen to be a business that has a turnover of over $1 billion, then a 50% reduction when comparing to a similar comparable period from last year. There is an exception to major bank levy if you're a business who has a major bank levy, and that's financial institutions, deposit institutions, banks, etc. They're accepted or excluded. Now, once you fall into one of those categories, the next question is whether or not you have eligible employees, and it's quite easy. One, the employee has to have been employed as at the 1st of March this year. They may no longer be employed, so that's okay. You can re-employ them now. So if you've made them redundant and you regret that redundancy, or you want to get them back on board, you can bring them back on board and re-employ them. I saw in one of our questions, someone had asked a question about, if we're going to re-employ people who have been made redundant, is there a problem there about restrictions about re-employing people who have been made redundant? Now, the first thing to say about that is there's no general rule at law that you cannot re-employ someone who's been made redundant. There are in some government departments and companies sometimes have policies whereby they have a rule that you will not re-employ someone who's been recently made redundant. There's a whole range of reasons for that. No need for us to go into that today, but that is not a general rule. So if you happen to work in a business where you don't have a policy about re-employing people who've been made redundant, and frankly, if you do, you could change the policy, then if you've made someone redundant, there's nothing legally, in a general sense, preventing you from re-employing that person. That was one of the questions we had. Now, it relates to employees who are full-time, part-time, or if you're a regular and systematic casual with 12 months service. As a regular and systematic casual, they need to be 16 years of age and older, and they have to be an Australian citizen or fall within one of the visa holder categories that are identified in the materials. We'll make that material available on the various hubs that we've advertised today through our session. Now, one of the things to identify is that once the JobKeeper payment is paid on to the employee, it's in the nature of income, so it'll be taxed as such. But there are different scenarios that are at play here, and I know Ian and I were having a chat earlier, and he's got some questions about this that we'll talk about. But the first scenario is this one: you've got an employee who's stood down without pay. In that scenario, you would pay on the $1,500 to the employee, It might need to be subject to taxation. I'll let you take tax advice from your accountants, but it would normally be taxed as income as far as I'm aware. Now, one of the things is we don't quite have the detail.
No, we don't. This has all been done by sort of press release or Q&A documents, so the details will follow, and there's a lot of details that need to come.
But once we've got that detail, we'll just clarify whether or not any of this detail needs clarification. But this is consistent with the material that's gone out. The second scenario is if you've got an employee who's still performing work, but they happen to earn less than $1,500 a fortnight. So let's say you've got a casual who's now working in a cafe, obviously only serving coffees if you're in one of the jurisdictions that has the restaurants and cafes shut down. As is the case certainly in New South Wales and Queensland. You might go up to the window to, buy coffee from this fellow. This fellow or this lady might only work 3 hours that day, and they might only work 2 days a week because their hours have been reduced, and the employer's trying to share the hours amongst all of the employees. That employee might only earn $350 a week from you, or $400 a week, and now the government is giving you $1,500 a fortnight in relation to that employee. You will pay all of that money to the individual employee. Now, a whole range of questions arise about whether or not you have to pay superannuation on that amount. Do you pay workers' comp on that amount? Do you pay tax on that whole amount? My understanding is that it will be subject to income tax. When it comes to workers' compensation, it's important that you talk to your accountants about whether or not you need a separate line item, and I think this is the case, a separate line item in your P&L and a separate line item in relation to the employees on their pay slips about which portion is paid in respect of ordinary hours, ordinary time earnings, so that you can then apply superannuation to that portion of the work that's ordinary time earnings, because my understanding is that the rest of it will not be.
So I read the stuff this morning and a few things jumped out at me. One was about double dipping. So you may have had people who are stood down and they may be pursuing through Services Australia or through job seekers access to one of the packages there. And the message that came back from the government was that it's the obligation of the employee to disclose to Services Australia as to whether they're participating in both schemes. And so an adjustment will be done in regard to double dipping.
Yep.
The other one was self-employed. Self-employed are described as not really an eligible employee, they're actually an eligible employer. If they meet the criteria of the 30% dip in revenue, then they can put their hand up and participate in that way as well.
Yes.
And the other one is, and this is quite a curious thing, is that the regulator is the ATO. And it's a curiosity as to whether that's going to be a fantastic thing or a challenge. I think time will tell.
Well, I think they've done that for a range of reasons. One of the reasons is they're managing it through single touch payroll to a degree. Yeah. And so that just brings it, largely into one department.
They'll be the discretion holder though as well. So for people who are in the grey areas, they'll be the ones making the decisions. I think it's an extremely bold initiative, but I guess this is the time for bold initiatives.
Well, I think it is. I think it's wonderful. And I think what it will mean is that there will be many businesses out there that will save their businesses. It will create some confusion for some businesses because whilst brutal and potentially long-term problematic, a lot of businesses have moved to do a whole range of things, whether it's standing down their workforce in whole or in part, or making redundancies, either targeted or wholesale redundancies. Those were very clear decisions to make. What this does do is it does present employers with a question about whether or not they can engineer an arrangement which helps them keep the employees, look after their employees at the same time, stop their business from going under, and come out the back end of this with, something to work with.
There's one other aspect which I think is a challenge at the moment, and time will tell, but there seems to be there's critical dates. One is the 1st of March, which is the test as to when are you an employee. One is that the scheme effectively runs from the 30th of March to the 30th of September, so we've got a 6-month period. And then the next one is that the first payment will be at the end of the first week of May. So for those people who are talking about stoppages now, and do they retain people, do they not retain people, or what do they do, they're the critical dates, and keeping everybody on the books if they possibly can is quite a decision, because if you're an employee and on the books, then you can participate in this scheme.
That's right, and I think as we were discussing this morning, Ian, this is actually a subsidy that's paid to the employer.
Yeah.
It's not paid to the employee. It goes to the employer in the first instance, and then it is paid to the employee if the scenario that fits the employee warrants payment to them. So I've already talked about two of those scenarios here. The first one is the employee who stood down without pay. They get the $1,500 that flows through the employer as if it was a payroll department. And then the second scenario where you've got someone who's working less, you might pay them $800 a fortnight. You will then pass on an extra $700 on top of that, so they get the full $1,500. That means, of course, that you as an employer are subsidised for the $800 that's paid to the employee. And this is what it's meant for. It's an employer subsidy.
Yep.
But it has that dual benefit of benefiting the employees, particularly in the scenario where you've got an employee who stood down. And I've got the third scenario here that I didn't talk about before, but I'll deal with now, and that is if you've got someone who's already paid more than $1,500 per fortnight because they work the hours warranting payment for more than $1,500 per fortnight, then, of course, the $1,500 goes to the employer and subsidises the first $1,500 that you're paying to that employee for that fortnight. And then it's up to you to pay the rest. And, of course, you will then pay superannuation on the whole lot. You'll be levied for your workers' compensation, payroll tax and everything else on the base of the full wage.
So that's interesting because it is a subsidy. Purely and simply, it is an employer subsidy, and then there's a distribution obligation to go down to people who meet the eligible employee test.
Yep.
Okay.
And so, I mean, another scenario would be, I suppose, just to try and draw a distinction. If you are an employer who has an employee who's taking leave, long service leave, and you get the subsidy, then you keep the subsidy because the subsidy then feeds into the leave that you're paying to that employee.
Yeah.
Some other, just quickly on obligations, just to wrap up quickly, there is monthly reporting requirements. There are also reporting requirements for sole traders and self-employees, as Ian's already mentioned down the bottom of the screen there, that there's self-employed people, sole traders can actually apply for this grant themselves.
Joe, before we jump onto that, maybe we can just do some of these stand-down questions because we've got quite a few of them. Okay, we'll go quickly. Can you stand down an employee in a department and leave others alone as the requirements for the staff reduces due to a turn down in business?
Yeah, so on the face of it, that question, the answer would be no, because if you've got a range of employees in the department, some of them are performing work and others don't have any work to do, then there's still work to do. There might be a stoppage of work in relation to some employees because those particular employees just haven't been given any work. Or you could spread out. I suppose you might find that all of them are only doing a tiny bit of work, but that really feeds back into what I was saying before about demand-driven stand-down. If the flow of work comes down to a trickle, there is still work to perform. It's not a stoppage of work. So on the face of it, the answer to that one is no. You can't do that.
Okay, next one. If the government directs closures of swimming pools, for example, does that mean that the employer can lodge a stand-down order for those employees that only work as to those swimming pools?
Look, on its face, provided you go through the process I talked about before, has there been a stoppage of work? Well, it seems to be the case on the face of it there. Is there useful employment for these employees elsewhere in the business? And once you've been through that process, the answer is probably yes to that one. I mean, obviously we'd need to see the detail, but the answer is probably yes. Okay. I think swimming pools are often, not always, but often run by local councils, and local councils are not under the federal scheme. So they have a slightly different arrangement when it comes to stand down, and local councils need to apply to the Industrial Relations Commission for a stand down order. They can't do it themselves.
Okay. Similar theme. If your business has moved to an online platform and you find that not all of your staff are required, what are the stand down provisions for this?
Again, it's very similar to the first scenario we talked about. If you've only got a few employees who don't have work and everyone else does, or you've got half your workforce or even a few of your workforce, it still doesn't amount to a stand down. And this is the gap that the current pandemic has created for us in the legislation, that businesses are forced to consider a whole range of things. First one is stand down. That falls away very quickly in that scenario as being not really a lawful option. If you do stand people down without pay, forcibly, and you don't lawfully have the basis for doing so, you can face penalties later on because you have failed to pay people. You can also face compensation claims on the basis that the employee had a right to be provided with work and be paid for it, or at least be paid for it if you weren't going to supply the work. You've then sort of jumped from stand down to things like redundancy. Now, obviously, in between there is scope for employers and employees to agree to a whole range of things, and we're going to talk about that a little bit after this, after the next section we're going to talk about. But if we're talking about decisions that the employer must make on its own without agreement of its employees, you do have these harsh realities of stand down or redundancy. And there are other things like, being able to direct people to take leave, if you have the right to do so, if the employee has excessive leave, or the award changes that we're going to talk about in a minute as well, can provide employers with an ability to talk to employees about taking leave.
Okay, next question. In the event of shutdown, do employees that haven't already been stood down need to be paid?
Sorry, say that one again.
In the event of shutdown, do employees that haven't already been stood down need to be paid?
So if there's a shutdown and it's a stand down, and it's clearly a stand down, then no, the employees that are now being subject to stand down will not be paid going forward. In that, putting to one side the JobKeeper payment. So no.
Okay. Second last. More clarity regarding stand down. Legislation suggests that there needs to be a stoppage of work. However, the question says, I have seen many examples of stand downs used just where there is a deterioration of demand in some businesses. So this is the question, what does stoppage actually mean? And
this is consistent with what I said a few minutes ago when we started talking about stoppage of work. I said that there are a range of businesses out there that have, I think we've been using the term this week, running the gauntlet, because there's been a significant downturn in the demand for their business, demand for their services, demand for their products. And in that scenario, it makes good business sense to shut down, absolutely. It's a smart thing to do. And if you run the right comms with your employees, then you can probably come out of this largely unscathed, but whether or not it's lawful is a different question. And so that the person who's just asked that question is spot on. There seems to be a range of businesses that engaged in stand downs that may not have had the right to have stand down. We've talked about Section 524. We've talked about the need for there to be a stoppage of work independent of anything the employer's doing. There may be provisions in an enterprise agreement or a contract. If you have stand-down provisions in your contract or stand-down provisions in your enterprise agreement that meet the requirements of Section 524 to be a proper stand-down provision, then there may be other circumstances where you could stand people down. I've yet to see one that's more creative than 524, except maybe one in an employment contract that we saw that provided the employer with some reasonable circumstances. But now is not the time to be running around trying to get people signed up to new employment contracts with stand-down provisions. If you're going to be doing that, then you'd be talking to your employees about an agreed arrangement.
So how does sorry, can you just touch on that? Contracts with stand-down provisions, so that's obviously different from the legislation. So is this a consequence of being stood down? You have a contractual...
Yeah, so what the Act provides for, and I skipped over it a little bit before because it's quite a detailed and complex area, but as you can see here, on the first dot point we've got here on the screen, before standing down an employee or group of employees, a business should check any relevant enterprise agreement or contract for alternative stand-down provisions. Now, in the Fair Work Act, it says, look, 524 says, this is what a stand-down is, and we've got that up on the screen here. And then it says, however, if you have stand-down provisions that include these in a contract or an enterprise agreement, that's the right place to look for how you manage a stand-down with an employee or a group of employees. And so it's important for businesses to check their contracts, to check their enterprise agreements if they do have a stand-down. I don't want to confuse stand-down with close-down. I know that people start to go, well, hang on, this is all getting very confusing, shutdown, close-down, stand-down. There are some close-down provisions in a large number of the awards, and certainly historically, whereby businesses would shut down historically on the basis to give employees time to take their annual leave. So it was really an annual leave shutdown. And so if you go to the annual leave provisions of some of the awards, you'll see in there that there's a close-down provision for employees to take annual leave. There might be an opportunity for some businesses to take advantage of that. That's obviously contingent on employees having leave. And there were some amendments proposed to the awards that would tweak those close-down provisions.
Okay, last question on stand-downs. Do staff who have been stood down automatically get Centrelink payments?
I'm not a social security expert, but my understanding was that if you were stood down, you could, provided you could get something from your employer, you couldn't get a separation certificate, but provided you could provide some justification to Centrelink, you could get payments for being stood down. They were looking after people in that respect. But this JobKeeper arrangement, if the employer qualifies and the employee qualifies, will probably deal with that.
And I think we've got the parallel package as well for job seekers, which was released about a week before. So
yes, yeah, absolutely.
So I think that's the place I'd look first. All right.
Okay.
Joe, have a rest.
Ceasing operations and commercial issues.
Okay, this is my one. We'll just go through these headlines and just talk quickly to them. So PM wants the economy to go into hibernation. Hibernation was a word which was obscure and not used in a commercial context. It was used by Scott Morrison about a week ago. It was used by the Treasurer this morning in relation to his participation in the G20 hookup last night, where he pushed the position that the world economy should go into hibernation for 6 months. What does it mean? Well, there is no definition. I think the best bet that we have is that it's an intention to put economies and participants in the economies into a moratorium position where they will be protected for the consequences that would normally flow for a default or insolvency or similar events, such that they will be ring-fenced, and when the 6 months or whatever period of the crisis finishes, at the end of that time, normal business will continue. But we just do not have details yet. So let's go down to some specifics. So we are moving into a situation where business is still trading as it should, but clearly the circumstances are different. We are getting calls from people sort of saying, do we have the ability to rely on force majeure clauses in our contracts, or does frustration apply? Now, the event that gives rise to exercising a force majeure clause or to rely on frustration may in fact be the same event, but the force majeure clauses and frustration work in different ways. Frustration is a contract doctrine. It's a defence, so that if an allegation was made to a party to a contract that they hadn't performed, you may have access to a defence of frustration where you would say that there are good reasons outside of the control of that party, and because of those reasons the contract has been frustrated. So it is a defence, it's a formal defence to non-performance of a contract. Force majeure may have the same factual basis, but force majeure is a contract by contract concept, and force majeure clauses are different depending upon the contracts. But the way it would roll is during the life of the contract, if an event occurred, for example, the sort of classic event would be a flood or some form of civil unrest, one party may say, I cannot perform it and I will exercise my rights under force majeure. And the force majeure clause, each of them will be different, but it will say if a force majeure event as defined occurs, then you can suspend your performance of the contract for a given period. So the devil is in the detail in the force majeure clause, but they are not self-acting. There is really important context as to how they may arise and how you would actually exercise them or not. So the issue there is, I think, to look at your contracts and work out where you are and whether you want to exercise a force majeure or whether you're on a performance end of a contract and you want to consider using frustration as a defence. There is a point, this is a comment on contractual performance. There's a point where the law is a bit inflexible. It may be too confrontational and it may get in the way of retaining a good and strong relationship. So in those contexts, we would suggest try and think through and engage your counterparty in working through an alternative solution which will retain the contract, allow it to resurrect itself and provide for ongoing positive relations.
I can see there's some synergies here in between the employment situation and the commercial situation. And you were just talking about force majeure and frustration. They're not dissimilar to a stoppage of work situation.
No, right. It could be the same factual circumstance that gives rise to them.
Yeah.
There we go. Forward.
There we go.
Yeah. Okay. Business owners' liability and insolvency. We're moving into Scott Morrison's world of hibernation, but we're not there yet. And so at the moment, what happens? If you are a business owner and you've got some important decisions to make, such as stand down, what do you need to think about in making that decision? Well, at the moment, conventional laws still apply. We have not yet moved into any meaningful variation of the current rules. So when you're making those decisions, please just consider the consequences of a big decision as it may attach to you individually. So for the present time, insolvency applies. There has been one meaningful change, which was at a federal level about 10 days ago. There was an amendment for 6 months to what is known as the safe harbour defence. Safe harbour provides a defence for insolvency incurred by a business where the business owners should have known or did know that the business was moving towards insolvency. Safe harbour said that in certain circumstances, if you make decisions and expend further money, and those decisions are for the good of the business in exploring alternatives to keep it going, you are not liable. What the change has done is it's removed a lot of the technical requirements to safe harbour. So it is a broadening and easier access to that offence. And so you can see the policy behind this is to perhaps back the business owners to do what it takes to keep the businesses going. This last point, really last meaningful operational point, is about landlords, tenants and mortgages. This is in response to what has been on the public agenda for about 2.5 weeks now. There has been promised at a federal level, particularly in response to the National Cabinet, that there would be a full national response to the issue of landlords, tenants and as an add-on, mortgages. There really has not been any legislative response just yet. So what we do know is it is a matter that's been on the agenda of the National Cabinet for at least 1.5 to 2 weeks. There was a response promised last week, but I think events just saw it move down the list of agenda items. It's one of those issues where federation plays a role in it. The federal government has no role really in land law. So the responses will have to be generated by the individual states and territories. Gladys Berejiklian and Dan Andrews are on record as saying that they are ready to go and they want to go with providing various specific legislative relaxations and protections for tenants. But they haven't done so. And we're really relying upon what has been said to us rather than what's been issued in writing and produced. A curiosity has appeared, which is that the big four banks are, in a strange way, being used as a deliverer of government policy. So what we've had in the last few days is that we've had the Australian Bankers Association, on behalf of primarily the big four banks, has come out and said that the big four banks will provide mortgage relief to affected landlords, but on the condition that they will not evict any of their commercial tenants during this crisis. So that is clearly not the law. Clearly it's a matter of policy. Clearly the big four banks, being competitive beasts, will have slightly different terms amongst themselves, but it is a meaningful plank in what we hope will become the full landlord, tenant and mortgagee relief. There's a throwaway at the bottom, which is, whilst we're waiting for the package to be brought into being, it is important just to wait, because the devil will be in the detail, and there will very probably be some differences from jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
Thanks, Ian. And I think that point about the banks is an important one, because it means everyone's chipping in.
It is, and one could speculate as to why the banks have become strong public citizens. The Hayne Royal Commission perhaps showed them the way forward. Okay, this is the final point. There have been changes for the next 6 months or so to the operating rules governing the courts. So if you're in the middle of one or about to start a dispute, just be aware that there may be changes to the rules, the dates, the times and so on. But equally, in relation to just general commercial life and disputes, don't forget to check your mail, don't forget to check your material contracts, because you don't want to find yourself in a dispute and be chasing. So please just be aware of just the normal flow of correspondence and deal with it. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Ian. We might just talk quickly about, I won't spend a lot of time on this because we will run out of time, and I would like, if you're watching, to go away and have a look at these awards yourselves to see whether or not they can assist you. We have had an unprecedented level of cooperation between employer groups and unions. And as I said a minute ago, everyone's chipping in. Well, everyone really is chipping in. And we have seen the culmination of that cooperation in recent decisions from the Fair Work Commission, whereby schedules have been added to a number of awards already, and there's more in the pipeline, in relation to hospitality, clerks and restaurants. Now, our firm's had a heavy involvement in that, and in particular Lewis Izzo, our Managing Director, Sydney, had a very significant role in putting in a lot of groundwork there, and our CEO, Nigel Ward, who appeared in the Clerks Award and is quoted in the decision as noting the generosity of spirit of the parties being involved. I talked earlier about the ACTU being involved in the job seeker behind, lobbying for the job seeker payment. This is another example of unions and employer groups coming together. The Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the Australian Industry Group, the ACTU, the United Workers Union, the Australian Services Union, the Australian Workers Union, and a number of other unions have all come together at different points over the last month and a half in urgent meetings, and have done some great work to come to consent positions that are presented to the Commission. Not to leave the Fair Work Commission out, the Fair Work Commission's also come to the party and chipped in as well, and has given priority to these matters. In fact, the clerks matter was dealt with last Saturday morning. So everyone got up on a Saturday, which they wouldn't normally do that. I know the Commission members have historically been called upon at night and on the weekends to do things, but this is another occasion where they have demonstrated generosity of spirit. So I'll just run you quickly through some of these amendments. The Clerks Award, and they're very similar amendments across the awards, certainly the two I'm talking about today. Operational flexibility has been included in the schedule. So if you go back to the award, there's this schedule that talks about COVID-19, and these amendments being included for the purposes of dealing with the current environment, the current pandemic. So what that flexibility does is it allows an employer to ask an employee to work across classifications rather than the traditional way under awards where if you employ someone as a level 3, then they'll do the work of a level 3. If they're then asked to do the work of a level 4, in this scenario, they will still perform the work of a level 4 and the employer will maintain the salary at level 3. Vice versa, if you ask the employee to perform the work of a level 2 or a level 1, they will still be paid their level 3 rate at which they're paid. The duties have to be safe. The employee has to be qualified to do the work. They might be at a lower duty, as I've said before, but without reduction of pay, as I've said. There's an ability to change the spread of hours for people that are working from home, so there's some flexibility built in there as well. I've got those up on the screen there. The spread of hours has been expanded from 6 to 11, 6 a.m. to 11 p.m. On a Monday to Friday and 7 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. on a Saturday. Some other amendments very quickly for the Clerks Private Sector Award is you can have an agreement by a majority of employees to reduce hours. So if you get 75% majority voting in favour of reducing their hours across the board, you can reduce people's hours to 75% of their ordinary or their agreed hours, depending on whether they're full-time or part-time. It's important you consult. Consultation is an important factor here. It's also something I probably left out at the beginning when we were talking about stand down. It's our view you should consult about stand down as well. For part-time employees and casuals, there's also some changes there where they've reduced minimum engagements to 2 hours. So you have to roster employees for at least 2 hours. If an employee who's part-time works in excess of 38 hours per week or an average of 38 hours on a roster system, then they get overtime for that as well. The Restaurants Industry Award has also had similar amendments in relation to operational flexibility. I won't go through those again, but they're pretty much the same. Slightly different in relation to reduction in hours. If you get a majority agreeing, similar to the clerks, but there's a variation in terms of the hours, they can be reduced between 60% and 100%. There's a requirement to consult. For annual leave, and this is also available under the clerks, employers and employees may agree to take up up to twice as much annual leave at a proportionally reduced rate, including any close down period. And I mentioned close down before in relation to annual leave. An employer may direct an employee to take any accrued leave by giving at least 24 hours notice. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I foreshadowed I pointed out there were some tweaks to the close down provisions in relation to annual leave, and where an employee is required to take annual leave during a close down, the employer must give at least 1 week's notice. Notice periods were a lot longer than that in most awards. And during a close down, an employee can take all of their annual leave and then will be given leave without pay for the remainder of the shutdown. Any close down of the operations must not extend beyond 30 June, being the focal date for these amendments. Right, as we come into the final straight or the back end of this session for me and Ian today, I might just run quickly through some of these managing leave options. At the moment, you have to be careful about split rosters because, as Ian already talked about earlier today, there are these restrictions around people going to work when they can actually perform their work at home. So if you can perform work at home, you should be allowing your workers to perform work at home. But where they do need to be in the office, consider whether or not you have a split roster. That way, if there is an outbreak and we don't have this continued decline, which has been nice news over the last four or 5 days, flattening the curve, as we keep hearing the phrase, if you split your teams, you at least isolate a number of people. We did that in our office. Ian and I were on shift A and we weren't allowed to sit here with people from shift B so as not to contaminate the various shifts. Working from home is an obvious one. Talking to people about having leave. And can I just say, when we talk about any of these arrangements, and I won't go through all of them, but if we're talking about any of these, consultation is the key and communication. Trying to reach agreement with your employees. Everyone understands that the circumstances that everyone is facing, particularly businesses and employees who are being stood down without pay, that everyone wants to try and come out the back end of this with in as good a shape as we can come out. Yep. And that means let's be nice to each other now. Let's try and get to an agreed position. We do know that there'll be positions or situations where businesses will need to make hard decisions about stand down and about redundancies and things like that. And you will have to face that when the time comes, including one of the scenarios we've got up here on the screen, the second dot point about making an application under Section 120 to reduce or defer any redundancy payments. If your business is in dire straits already, that might be an option you'd need to consider if you want to make sure your employees get paid their redundancy pay. It is not enough that you can't afford to pay redundancy pay and terminate someone's employment and not pay them their redundancy pay. If you have an obligation to pay redundancy pay, and that is for businesses that have 15 or more employees, there's that obligation on Section 119 to pay redundancy pay. Then if you can't afford it, you need to consider whether or not to approach the Commission to defer those payments. There are other options. Long service leave amendments were made in New South Wales to enable employees to take their long service leave in a manner that's more palatable than historically was provided for under the Act. You can also consider leave in advance arrangements as they're available under the various awards and the like. Temporary variations of hours of work, and I just want to say about that when you engage with your employees about trying to reduce their hours of work, it has to be by agreement. And we've already talked about how you might do that under the award across a business if you've got award employees. But for non-award employees, it's really important that you understand that a contract is an agreement between two people and it can't be broken by one, or it can't be varied by one unilaterally. If you want to vary the arrangement, then consultation and communication are the key, really. And I can say that what we have seen is a lot of cooperation from employers and employees. I'm yet to see a bad story. It's actually been quite heartening, and to see employers trying to do the right thing by their employees and employees trying to do the right thing by their employer at the same time. It's been heartening to see that. The last couple of points I wanted to mention, and we might have a couple of questions we might deal with as well. Workers' compensation's come up a bit. Perhaps the reason for that is, of course, there have been some cases over the years about people who've injured themselves at home while working from home. There's the person who slipped down the stairs on their socks. There's some other ones I won't mention which are a little more lurid. It is important that you understand that even though we are in the midst of a state of emergency in some states, as has been declared, and also a pandemic that's causing that state of emergency, it is important that you understand you still have health and safety obligations to your employees. You still need to put in place the arrangements you normally would when it comes to working from home, and that means doing home assessments, helping people understand how to do a home assessment if you're getting your employees to do it. There are a whole range of ways of doing that. If you go to the Business Australia website, you will find that there are resources there available to you to address those concerns. There's even an employer kit there that can address these working from home.
Just a quick question then. There's a question on stood-down workers and workers' compensation. Does it apply if you stood down?
Yeah, so if an employee stood down and they're not performing any work for you, then and they're not in the workplace, which they shouldn't be, then their workers' comp should not arise.
Okay.
Even though, and I understand the question, even though the employee is accruing leave during that period, they can take annual leave, they can take sick leave, they can take long service leave, and they should be paid for public holidays. Even though all of those things apply, they're not actually performing work for you. So I find it difficult to see. I could come up with a really wild scenario, but most scenarios would not provide a basis for an employee to make a claim. There was a question around whether or not an employee could make a workers' compensation claim for COVID, for catching COVID while they're at work. Look, it's possible. The scenario is slightly different. That is, proving causation would be more difficult than usual. The individual may very well have caught it somewhere else. There might be a scenario where it's very obvious that they did catch it at work. I could see that occurring. Then the employer has the employee has a slightly higher bar than a usual workers' compensation claim. If it's a disease, in some states and territories, it requires that the employment is the main contributing factor to the injury or the illness, or the disease in this case. We've got just a couple of minutes left. Quickly, just remember, even though it's tough times, you will potentially come across scenarios where you need to manage employees' behaviour while they're at home. Keep an eye on that. As working from home becomes the norm, if we end up doing this up until 30 June, as the Fair Work Commission's considering, or 30 September, as the government is planning to provide that insurance or that subsidy from a JobKeeper perspective, then we will find that people will become a little more reckless. I think what my general advice to employers would be, let's be a little bit compassionate about employees working from home. You can get cabin fever and it can cause people to do certain things. So you might extend your tolerance just a little bit more when it comes to people working from home. Just make sure you provide people with clear guidance about, what you expect from them. And we've got the public holidays coming up for the Easter break. As I've already said, you've got these public holidays. You would normally pay employees who are stood down for public holidays. The JobKeeper subsidy will provide employers with an ability to subsidise that, which is perhaps a nice thing, or at least a consolation prize for some employers. I'm not sure we've really got much time for any other questions, do we, Ian?
No, we don't. We've run out of time. So,
just quickly, these are our resources. I've already mentioned these. You can go to our website, ablawyers.com. You can contact us on info@ablawyers. And I've already mentioned a number of times, businessaustralia.com if you want daily updates and government responses. Thank you very much for joining us today, Ian.
Yeah, thank you very much. And please stay